Welcome back, my friend, to this quiet harbor of the mind, a place where the tales of old can rock us gently into a state of peaceful rest. My name is Thomas, and it is a delight to have you with me tonight. Let us put aside the cares of our modern world, for we are about to journey back in time, to a land of sun-drenched mountains, shimmering seas, and whispered prophecies. A land where gods and mortals walked side by side, and where legends were born. So, find your most comfortable position in bed. Let your body grow heavy and your mind become light. And when you are ready, close your eyes. Take a long, slow, deep breath in, holding it for just a moment at the top, and then, let it all go with a soft sigh. One more time now. Breathe in the calm of this present moment, and as you breathe out, release all the distractions of the day. Good. Now, let our story begin. Let us join a hero at the very start of his grand adventures. In the mountains, nestled in the very heart of ancient Greece, there was a place of profound and sacred power. A place named Delphi. For the ancient Greeks, this was not just another town, it was the omphalos, the navel, the absolute center of the world. To stand in Delphi was to stand at the axis of creation. The sanctuary was cradled by a dramatic amphitheater of limestone cliffs, known as the Phaedriades, or the Shining Ones. This name was no poetic exaggeration. When the midday sun struck the pale rock face, the cliffs would blaze with a light so brilliant, so dazzling, it was as if the gods themselves were casting down a spotlight from Olympus, illuminating the landscape and the beautiful temples that had been built in their honor. Among the several magnificent temples that graced the sanctuary, perhaps the most glorious of all was the one dedicated to Apollo, the radiant god of sun and light, of poetry, music, and dance. He was the god of healing, of truth, and, most importantly, of prophecy. From every corner of the known world, people would undertake long and arduous pilgrimages to visit this temple. They came as kings and as commoners, as soldiers and as poets, all seeking something. And they came not just to pay their respects to the great god Apollo, but to consult with his earthly vessel, a high priestess, a woman known simply as the Oracle. She was the voice of the god, a conduit for divine wisdom. She could provide answers to the most challenging questions, untangle the most knotted dilemmas, and offer guidance to those who felt utterly and hopelessly lost. Pilgrims would leave Delphi transformed, carrying with them a feeling of profound peace and a renewed sense of purpose. One sun-drenched afternoon, a man stood waiting his turn outside the grand temple of Apollo. He stood apart from the other pilgrims, a figure of quiet contemplation. He had traveled for many days to be here, and he had dutifully taken part in all the required rituals, the fasts, the cleansings, the solemn processions along the sacred way, all designed to purify the body and spirit in preparation for this singular meeting. And now, after all that waiting, it was almost time. The man was tall and powerfully built, his muscles sculpted not for show but for function. He had a short, dark beard and a head of thick, curly hair. His skin was tanned a deep golden brown, the result of countless long days spent on horseback under a relentless sun. At a first, casual glance, one might assume he was young, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. But there was something in his dark, watchful eyes that spoke of a much older soul. They held a depth, a shadow of weariness and sorrow that contradicted the youthfulness of his face. The other pilgrims at Delphi noticed this man. They couldn't help it. He possessed a kind of aura, an almost physical presence that made him stand out. They exchanged hushed whispers, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and awe. Who was he? Some swore they saw a glint of the divine in his gaze, a spark of something not quite mortal. And they were right. The man was not a god, not yet, but he was the son of a god. His name was Hercules. His father was the mighty Zeus, king of all the gods, lord of the sky and thunder. His mother, Alcmene, was a mortal queen, but one whose wisdom and breathtaking beauty were said to rival the goddesses themselves. Even from his earliest days, there had been signs that Hercules was different, touched by destiny. When he was just 8 months old, 2 enormous, venomous snakes had slithered into the nursery he shared with his twin brother. His brother, seeing the terrifying creatures, had cried out in fear. But infant Hercules had simply watched them with a strange calm. Then, with a gurgle of what might have been laughter, he had reached out with his pudgy little hands, grabbing a snake in each, and with an impossible, preternatural strength, had squeezed the life out of them. A famous prophet, Tiresias, was consulted, and he predicted a future of extraordinary heroism for the child, a destiny filled with battles against monsters and a legacy that would echo through eternity. But that was a long time ago. Over the years, Hercules grew up. He became a man, strong and capable. But he had not yet become a hero. In recent years, a profound sense of restlessness, a feeling of being lost, had settled upon him. He had all this strength, this divine heritage simmering in his blood, but he lacked direction. He lacked purpose. And so he had come here, to Delphi, the center of the world, to find it. As he stood there, waiting in front of the temple, he was surprised by how relaxed he felt. All his life he had been impatient, rushing from one experience to the next. But now, in this sacred place, he felt a deep sense of calm, an almost meditative state. Perhaps it was the effect of the rituals, or the dreamy procession with laurel leaves in his hands. Already, Delphi had begun to change him, and he hadn't even met the oracle yet. Taking a slow, deep breath, he looked out at the valley spread below, the sprawling olive groves, the clouds rolling over distant mountains, a bird of prey wheeling in slow, lazy circles high above. What a beautiful place, he thought. He felt so lucky to be here. Then, an old priest of Apollo called his name. It was time. The oracle would see him now. A thrill of nervous excitement shot through him as he followed the priest into the temple's heart, past enormous statues and columns. One column was inscribed with 2 simple words that seemed to burn into his mind. Know thyself. He was led into the innermost sanctuary, a small, dimly lit chamber where few were ever granted access. And there she was. The oracle sat on a golden, 3-legged chair, an old woman in a simple white dress, holding a sprig of laurel in one hand. The air was thick with a strange, sweet-smelling vapor that seemed to rise from a crack in the floor. As he breathed it in, Hercules felt his body relax even further, his mind becoming open and receptive. The oracle seemed to look at him without seeing him, her eyes lost in a deep trance. And when she finally spoke, her words were slow, slurred, and came out in a peculiar, tangled order, like a riddle he had to solve in his own mind. The message was this: Hercules must travel south and serve his cousin, the king Eurystheus. He must do whatever the king asked of him. If he did this, his reward would be eternal life. When Hercules left the temple and stepped back into the bright sunlight, his head was reeling. This was not the answer he had expected, nor the one he had wanted. To serve his cousin, a man he remembered as a petty bully from his childhood? It felt less like a heroic destiny and more like a punishment. But it was an answer. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he had to trust it. The oracle spoke on behalf of Apollo, and there was no higher authority. His pilgrimage to the center of the world was over. And now, a new and stranger journey was about to begin. The oracle's words echoed in his mind, a strange and unwelcome prophecy. It was not the grand destiny he had envisioned for himself, but it was a path nonetheless. And so, the next day, Hercules left the sacred slopes of Delphi, his pilgrimage to the center of the world having come to an end. Now, it was time to begin another, far longer journey. He collected his horse from the stables at the edge of town. She was a beautiful gray mare named Ianthe, meaning violet flower, and he loved her more than any other living creature. As he rested his head against hers, whispering promises of the road ahead, he didn't exactly feel excitement for the journey south to his cousin's palace, but at least they were together again. Once they were on the move, passing through golden fields and along high coastal paths overlooking the sparkling blue ocean, his mood began to lift. After the intense stillness of Delphi, it was refreshing to be in motion again. Village after village passed by in a blur of green hills and ancient olive groves, until at last, he arrived at the palace of King Eurystheus. Night had fallen, and in his fatigue, the palace, encircled by tall cypress trees, looked unreal, like something from a dream. His cousin, the king, a man Hercules remembered only vaguely from childhood as a bully who had once stolen his marbles, could barely contain his astonishment at Hercules' arrival. And when he heard the reason for the visit, that the oracle herself had commanded Hercules to serve him, the king's shock turned into a sly, cruel amusement. He laughed and gave Hercules a hearty pat on the back. He was sure, he said with a glint in his eye, that he could think of a few things for his heroic cousin to do. The next morning, as Hercules enjoyed a breakfast of honey-drenched pancakes on a shady terrace, the king appeared and gave him his first task. It was a challenge worthy of a hero, the king said cheerfully. Hercules was to travel to the nearby town of Nemea and slay the infamous Nemean Lion. Of course, Hercules had heard of the lion. All of Greece had. For years, it had roamed the woods near Nemea, a terror that kept the people locked in their homes. This was no ordinary lion. It was a monster, a giant beast said to be at least twice the size of a normal lion, with teeth like swords and a roar like thunder. Some whispered that it was descended from ancient monsters, others claimed it had clawed its way out of the underworld itself. Its hide, they said, was impenetrable, capable of turning aside any arrow or spear. Many brave warriors had tried to slay it. None had returned. Is true courage the absence of fear, or is it the ability to act despite it? As Hercules rode northwards towards Nemea, he did not feel fear. Instead, he felt a familiar sensation rising in his chest, the thrill of the challenge, the electric anticipation of the battle ahead. He knew how to turn fear into excitement, to see every obstacle as an adventure. When he entered the town of Nemea, the people gathered in the streets, calling out to him, wishing him luck. If anyone could defeat the lion, it was Hercules. He rode on towards the woods, his bow, arrows, and sword at the ready. To his surprise, however, the woods were unerringly silent. There was no sign of the beast. He dismounted, leaving a nervous Ianthe behind, and began to walk through the long grass. And then he saw it. On the other side of a clearing was a large cave, and peering out from the entrance were two enormous, amber eyes. As the lion emerged, Hercules stared in wonder. It was a monster, yes, but a magnificent one, with a shining, golden mane and thick fur that looked like armor. The battle was about to begin. Without hesitation, Hercules took aim and fired his arrows, one after another. But just as the legends claimed, they simply bounced off the lion's thick hide, leaving not a single mark. He then drew his sword and charged, striking the beast again and again, but the blade was useless against its impenetrable fur. By now he was so close he could feel the heat of the lion's breath on his face and the deep rumble of its growl in his own chest. There was only one thing left to try. Casting aside his useless weapons, Hercules lunged forward and wrapped his mighty arms around the monster's neck. And as he squeezed, he felt that familiar, ancient power coursing through him, a surge of divine strength he had not felt since he was an infant in his crib, crushing the life from two giant snakes. And just like that, it was over. The great lion lay on the grass, so still and peaceful it might have been sleeping. Hercules returned to the king, not with the body of the lion, which was too heavy to carry, but with a tuft of its golden mane as proof of his triumph. The king was impressed, but also, perhaps, a little frightened of his cousin's power. He quickly devised a second task, one even more impossible than the first. Hercules was to find and destroy the Lernaean Hydra. The Hydra was another legendary monster, a fearsome, snake-like creature that lived in a lake not far from the palace. Its horror lay not in its size, but in its multiplicity. It possessed numerous heads, and it was said that if you cut one off, another, or perhaps even two, would grow back in its place. It was, for all intents and purposes, invincible. But Hercules, filled with confidence from his first victory, was undeterred. He traveled to the marshes of Lerna and found the creature's lair. The Hydra rose from the murky water, a writhing mass of hissing, snake-like heads, at least 6 of them, all joined to a single serpentine body. Hercules first tried fire, shooting flaming arrows at the beast, but they had no effect. He then charged with his sword, swinging it with all his might and slicing clean through one of the monster's necks. He stepped back in relief, but his relief turned to horror as he watched the neck stump bubble and heal, and a new head grow back in a matter of seconds. He was perplexed. How could he possibly defeat a creature that could not be wounded? As he retreated into the safety of the nearby trees, a vision flashed in his mind with dazzling clarity, the stump of a tree, burning in the darkness. It was a spark of divine inspiration. He knew now what he had to do. He charged back towards the Hydra, taking off another head with his sword. But this time, before a new one could grow, he took a flaming torch he had prepared and pressed it against the open wound, cauterizing it with fire. It worked. No new head grew back. But just as victory seemed within his grasp, the goddess Hera, his eternal tormentor, intervened. She sent a giant silver crab out of the lake to attack him. Forced to fight 2 monsters at once, Hercules showed his true power. He brought his foot down on the crab with all his superhuman strength, crushing its shell, before returning his attention to the Hydra. One by one, he severed the heads and burned the necks, until only one remained. This last head, the largest, was said to be immortal. As his sword proved useless against it, another gift of divine aid arrived. A golden sword, sent by his protector Athena, appeared at his feet. With this sacred weapon, he cut off the final head, and the battle was over. His first two labors were complete. He had proven his strength, not just to the king, but to the gods, and to himself. After the defeat of the Hydra, Hercules returned to the palace, weary but victorious. His cousin, the king, was outwardly full of praise, but inwardly, he was growing more fearful of Hercules' power and, perhaps, a little jealous. He knew he could not defeat his cousin with tasks of pure strength. So, for the third labor, he devised a challenge that was different. It was a test not of muscle, but of cunning, patience, and near-infinite endurance. He ordered Hercules to find and capture the Nemean hind, the golden deer of Arcadia, and bring it back to the palace alive. The king knew this was a task designed for failure. For this was no ordinary deer. To learn more about his quarry, Hercules traveled to a rural farming area on the edge of the Arcadian woods. There, a friendly farmer and his wife welcomed the hero into their home. That evening, sitting by the warm glow of a crackling fire, the farmer's wife told him the story of the deer. The golden hind, she explained, was a sacred creature, the beloved property of Artemis, the powerful goddess of the hunt and the wilderness. Many years ago, the goddess had found a herd of 5 magnificent deer on the slopes of a mountain. They were larger than bulls, with fur that gleamed like pure gold and antlers that glittered as if spun from moonlight. Artemis, captivated by their beauty, tamed 4 of them to pull her golden chariot through the heavens. But the 5th, the most beautiful and swift of them all, she set free to run wild in the woods, a living testament to the untamed beauty of her domain. This deer, the farmer's wife said, was so swift it could outrun an arrow shot from a god's own bow. Many had tried to capture it. All had failed. And to harm it would be to incur the wrath of a goddess, a fate no mortal would wish for. There is the strength to break down a wall, and then there is the strength to wear it down, drop by patient drop, over a lifetime. Which form of strength do you think is greater? The explosive power of a hero in a single battle, or the quiet, unending endurance required for a task that seems impossible? Hercules was about to find out. He began his quest. He journeyed to the woods where the deer was said to live, and after many days of searching, he caught his first glimpse of it. It appeared in a sun-dappled clearing, a flash of impossible gold, its amber eyes staring at him for a single, electric moment before it vanished. And so, the chase began. It was a chase that lasted not for a day, or a week, or a month, but for an entire year. Hercules pursued the golden hind across all of Greece, a relentless, silent marathon that tested the very limits of his being. The seasons turned, and the landscape of the chase changed with them. Through the long, hot days of summer, he tracked it through dusty fields and arid hills, the sun beating down on his back. He would see it sometimes, a distant, shimmering mirage on the horizon, always just out of reach. He would climb a mountain, hoping to corner it, only to see it leap effortlessly across a chasm he could not cross. His initial confidence slowly gave way to a deep, frustrating patience. Then came autumn. The world turned to shades of red and gold, and the deer became a spirit of the season, a living flame moving through the painted forests. He followed its golden tracks through carpets of fallen leaves, his own quiet footfalls the only sound in the crisp, cool air. He learned the deer's habits, its paths, the places it went to drink from clear, cold streams. A strange respect began to grow in his heart. He was no longer just a hunter, he was a student of this magnificent, elusive creature. Winter brought the greatest hardship. He tracked the deer through deep snow, his own body aching with cold, his provisions running low. Sometimes he would lose the tracks for days, only to find them again by a stroke of luck. He huddled by small fires at night, staring up at the cold, unblinking stars, wondering if this chase would ever end. He felt a quiet kinship with the deer, both of them enduring the harshness of the season alone in the vast wilderness. His strength was useless here. All that mattered was the will to take one more step, and then another. And then, at last, came spring. The snows melted, the rivers swelled, and the world was reborn in a haze of green. And Hercules, after a year of relentless pursuit, felt a change in the air. The deer was growing tired. The chase had taken its toll on the divine creature as well. Finally, one afternoon, in a meadow filled with wildflowers, he found it. The golden hind, its magnificent chest heaving with exhaustion, was lying in the tall grass, fast asleep. Hercules approached with a reverence he had not known he possessed. This was not the triumphant cornering of a beast, but the quiet conclusion of a year-long pilgrimage. He looked down at the creature, its golden fur rising and falling with each deep breath, and he felt not pride, but a profound sense of connection. As silently as he could, he cast a specially made rope, creating a gentle harness around its neck. He had done it. But as he began to lead the sleeping deer away, a new figure appeared before him, a silvery light in the green meadow. It was the goddess Artemis herself, her face beautiful but stern, her bow in her hand. "What are you doing with my deer?" she asked, her voice as cool and clear as a mountain stream. Hercules, holding fast to his courage, began to explain. He told her of his quest, of the king's command, of the oracle's prophecy. He spoke not as a conqueror, but as a man bound by fate, expressing his deep admiration for the creature he had pursued for so long. He promised that no harm would come to it, that he was merely fulfilling his labor. Artemis listened, her expression softening slightly. She understood the burdens of destiny and the whims of kings. She agreed to let Hercules take the deer, but on one unbreakable condition. He could show it to the king, but then he must immediately set it free, unharmed, to return to her sacred woods. It was a bargain. Not a battle won with strength, but a peace achieved with words and respect. Hercules gratefully agreed. He had not only completed his task, but he had learned a new kind of heroism, the heroism of patience, of endurance, and of knowing when to fight, and when to speak. After his year-long chase and his delicate negotiation with a goddess, Hercules carefully guided the golden hind back to the palace of King Eurystheus. As promised, he presented the magnificent, living creature to his cousin. The king stared in disbelief, amazed that Hercules had succeeded in a task he was sure would be impossible. After a brief moment of inspection, and with a flicker of disappointment that his cousin had once again triumphed, the king declared the third labor complete. True to his word, Hercules immediately set the sacred deer free, watching as it vanished back into the wilderness like a fleeting golden sunbeam. The king, growing ever more desperate to find a challenge that would defeat Hercules, then assigned the fourth labor. This time, the task was one of brute force. A giant, monstrous boar was terrorizing the slopes of Mount Erymanthus, rampaging through fields and devouring crops. Hercules was to capture this beast and bring it back, alive. And so, Hercules found himself on the road again, riding towards the snow-capped peaks of the distant mountain. As he traveled through the countryside, the landscape turned colder, dusted with a fresh layer of white snow. The air was still and quiet, and the rhythmic crunch of Ianthe's hooves in the snow was a soothing, meditative sound. Here, in the quiet of the muted, wintry landscape, there were no distractions. He could let his mind clear, thinking of anything, or nothing at all. As he drew closer to the mountain, he began his search, not for the boar itself, but for any trace of it. He followed a series of craggy hills and caves, his eyes scanning the untouched snow for markings. And then he saw them. Hoof prints. They were too large to belong to a regular horse, and yet that is what they seemed to be. A strange curiosity sparked within him. A horse might take shelter in the mouth of a cave, but these tracks led directly inside one, into a tall, narrow entrance that disappeared into darkness. Intrigued, he decided to follow them. He dismounted, guiding Ianthe into the dark, narrow passageway. After a few moments, the tunnel began to widen, and he became aware of the warm, flickering glow of firelight up ahead. All at once, the space opened up, and Hercules found himself standing in the coziest, most enchanting cave he could have ever imagined. A large, crackling fire blazed at the center, its warmth a welcome blessing after the cold outside. The ground was covered with beautiful, hand-woven rugs, and the walls were lined with carved wooden chests and shelves filled with countless pots and drawers. And there, standing by the fire, was the source of the hoof prints. It was not a horse, not exactly. It was a centaur, a mythical creature with the legs and body of a horse, but the torso and head of a man. As another centaur emerged from an adjoining cave, Hercules found himself starstruck. He recognized the older one from legends and stories. This was Chiron, the wisest and most famous of all the centaurs, known throughout Greece for his mastery of music, archery, medicine, and prophecy. He was accompanied by a younger, quieter centaur named Pholus. Wisdom can be found in many places, in the grand pronouncements of oracles in their temples, or sometimes, in a cozy, firelit cave, shared over a cup of tea with an unexpected friend. Where do you think the most profound wisdom truly lies? The centaurs greeted Hercules with a warmth and kindness that immediately put him at ease. They were surprised to learn that he had come to this mountain in search of the great boar. Such a task, Chiron said with a rumbling laugh, was beneath a hero of Hercules' stature. Finding the boar would be easy, he explained. He often saw it plodding up and down the slopes of the mountain. The real challenge, Hercules explained, was capturing it alive and unharmed. At this, Chiron's eyes twinkled. Without knowing it, Hercules had come to exactly the right place, and to the right person, or rather, the right centaur. Chiron, the master of herbs and potions, had the perfect solution. He began to rummage through the countless small drawers that lined the cave wall, a space that reminded Hercules of a great apothecary shop. He took out handfuls of dried leaves, strange powders, and thick, sweet-smelling saps, mixing them together in a large pot. Soon, the concoction was bubbling over the flames, and the cave was filled with a smoky, deeply calming scent. The effect was almost instant. Even without tasting it, Hercules felt a wave of profound relaxation spread through his body. He knew that this was the answer. For the remainder of the day, Hercules relaxed in the company of the centaurs. They shared a meal and opened a jar of special red wine, a sacred gift, Chiron explained, from the wine god Dionysus himself. As Hercules savored the rich, fragrant drink, he listened as his new friends shared stories of their travels, their voices a low, comforting murmur against the crackling of the fire. He had come here expecting a battle with a beast, but instead, he had found fellowship, wisdom, and a peace he had rarely known. The next morning, Chiron guided Hercules up the snowy slopes of the mountain. The wise centaur knew every nook and cranny of the landscape, and he knew exactly where to find the boar's den, hidden beneath a tangle of fallen branches. Chiron took out the bait he had prepared, acorns that had been soaked in a calming herbal mixture. He placed them near the entrance to the den, and he and Hercules hid behind a nearby tree. They didn't have to wait long. Soon, a huge, twitching snout emerged from the den, followed by a brown, bristly body much larger than any normal boar. It was more like a bear in size. The boar greedily munched on the acorns, and after a few moments, its eyelids began to droop, its eyes glazing over. Now was the time. Hercules stepped out from behind the tree. The great beast registered his presence, but it was placid, almost tame under the influence of the herbs. With Chiron's help, Hercules was able to secure ropes and netting around the boar, creating a harness so he could lead it away. There was no battle, no violence. It was a capture achieved not through strength, but through wisdom, patience, and the help of a kind friend. As he prepared to leave, Chiron gave Hercules a parting gift, a small bag of special herbs for making tea. This way, Chiron said, Hercules could be reminded of his time on Mount Erymanthus. Moved by this gesture, Hercules thanked the centaurs for everything, promising to return one day. Giving help and sharing knowledge, Chiron replied with a smile, was its own reward. And so, with a final farewell, Hercules began his journey back to the palace, the great boar walking slowly and peacefully behind him. Hercules returned to the palace, leading the great Erymanthian boar, now calm and docile, behind him. His cousin, the king, was delighted to add another legendary creature to his growing menagerie. But with each success, the king's desire to see Hercules fail grew stronger. He had tried to defeat him with impenetrable beasts, with regenerating monsters, and with impossible chases. Now, he would try to defeat him with humiliation. For his fifth labor, the king gave Hercules a task devoid of glory, a chore meant to mock his heroic stature. Far to the west, in the kingdom of Elis, lived another king named Augeas. His stables, home to thousands of divine cattle, had famously not been cleaned for over 30 years. They were overflowing with an unimaginable amount of filth. Hercules' task, the king declared with a smirk, was to clean these stables, and to do it in a single day. Hercules was dismayed. He, the son of Zeus, the slayer of monsters, was being sent to shovel manure. He suspected this was his cousin's idea of a practical joke, a way to take him down a peg or two. But the oracle's command was absolute. And so, with a heavy sigh, he set off on the road to Elis. The journey was pleasant, taking him through lush countryside and alongside a wide, powerful river named the Alpheus. As he watched its sparkling waters flow towards the sea, he had no idea that this very river held the key to his success. When he arrived at the kingdom of Augeas, he found a palace that seemed to have been neglected. The walls needed painting, and a statue near the entrance was missing a hand. King Augeas himself was an elderly man who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else than sitting on his throne. He explained the situation with a weary smile. The stables were his main concern, an overwhelming problem he couldn't expect anyone to solve. When Hercules agreed to take on the task, the old king could hardly believe it. Leaving the palace, Hercules went to inspect the stables. The sight, and the smell, were staggering. It was a giant, sprawling complex, home to thousands of beautiful, immortal cattle. But the ground was covered in a mountain of filth, decades of waste piled high. He knew instantly that to attempt this task with a shovel would be impossible, it would take an eternity. His mind was blank. He had no idea where to begin. What makes a task heroic? Is it the slaying of a many-headed monster? Or is it the willingness to face a mountain of filth with humility, and to find a brilliant solution where others see only a degrading chore? Does true heroism lie in the nature of the challenge, or in the ingenuity and spirit one brings to it? That evening, as Hercules was tending to his horse, he met the king's son, a kind and energetic young man named Phyleus. Phyleus had heard of the great hero's arrival and insisted it would be an honor to help him in any way he could. Hercules laughed, saying he would need divine inspiration at the very least. That night, as he slept, that inspiration came. He dreamt of a great, rushing river, its powerful current washing over the land, cleansing everything in its path. He saw the water twisting and turning, merging with the land itself, and when he awoke, a smile was on his face. He knew exactly what to do. The next morning, he met Phyleus by the stables. First, he explained, they needed to move the cattle out into the pasture. Then, to his friend's amazement, Hercules took up a heavy axe. It was time, he said, to remodel the stables. With his superhuman strength, he knocked down the walls on two opposite sides of the sprawling complex, opening the entire structure to the elements. Then, with Phyleus helping him, he began to dig a trench, a long channel in the earth leading from the stables down towards the river he had followed on his journey, the Alpheus. They worked all day, digging and chatting, the time flying by. By late afternoon, their trench was nearly complete. Hercules then asked Phyleus to return to the pasture to keep the cattle safely away. Left alone, Hercules knelt by the riverbank, looking at the powerful current. He took his spade and began to dig the final section, breaking down the barrier of earth that separated his man-made channel from the mighty river. Back in the pasture, Phyleus heard it first, a distant, rumbling, rushing sound, almost like a roaring waterfall. He turned, and he watched in absolute wonder. A great torrent of water, diverted from the river, was pouring through the now open stables. The mighty rush of the river entered on one side and exited on the other, and as it flowed, it washed the stables clean. Decades of filth were swept away in a single, powerful, cleansing surge. And then, as if by magic, the flow of water stopped. Hercules had rerouted the river back to its original course. The stables, once a symbol of decay, were now pristine, sparkling in the afternoon sun. That evening, at a celebratory feast, Hercules was quick to point out that he had not worked alone, that Phyleus' help had been invaluable. The young prince, who would one day make a fine king, graciously accepted the compliment. Hercules had completed a year's work in a single day, not with a shovel and brute force, but with a dream, an axe, and the awesome, cleansing power of a river. He had proven that a hero's greatest weapon is not always his strength, but his mind. After the great cleansing of the Augean stables, Hercules enjoyed a rare and welcome period of rest at his cousin's palace. King Eurystheus, having failed to defeat the hero with tasks of strength, endurance, or humiliation, now seemed to be enjoying the game. For the sixth labor, he assigned Hercules a mission that was shrouded in a playful mystery. There was a problem, the king said with a mischievous twinkle in his eye, with some birds that were troubling the people near Lake Stymphalia. Hercules was to go there and solve the problem. What kind of birds? You'll see, was all the king would say. And so, Hercules journeyed to the lake, a wide expanse of green-blue water that seemed to blend seamlessly into the surrounding marshland. As he stood on the shore, he was struck by the atmosphere of the place. It was beautiful, but with an eerie, unnatural stillness. The surface of the lake was like a perfect mirror, reflecting the green hills and the sky without so much as a ripple. The only wildlife he could spot was a lone heron, standing motionless in the shallows as if it were a statue. A profound silence hung over the area, broken only by the muted, timid songs of a few birds hidden deep within the trees. It felt as though the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something. He spent the day exploring the shoreline, but found no trace of these troublesome birds. Then, as the sun began to set, turning the sky to amber and the lake to a sheet of dazzling gold, he saw them. First, he heard them. It was not the sound of feathers, but a strange, rattling, clinking noise, like the sound of armor in motion. Looking up, he saw a great flock of dark silhouettes gliding across the golden sky. As they drew closer, he watched in wonder. These were no ordinary birds. They were about the size of herons, but their bodies seemed to be made of metal. Their sharp beaks were cast from bronze, and their feathers were like overlapping plates of dark, metallic armor, all of it glinting in the last rays of the sun. They moved as one, a swift and purposeful flock, descending upon the fields on the far side of the lake, likely to devour the local crops. Hercules now understood the problem. But he also saw another one. The fields the birds had landed in were situated in the middle of a deep, impassable marsh. There was no way he could get close enough to shoot at them with his arrows, let alone confront them directly. He was stumped. That evening, he found lodging with a kind family who lived on the outskirts of the nearby town. The children, upon learning they were hosting the famous Hercules, were full of suggestions. The boys, full of youthful bravado, suggested he try to catch them in a giant net, or perhaps poison the crops they ate. But it was the youngest child, a little girl, who offered the simplest idea. There was no need to harm the birds, she said shyly. Perhaps he could simply scare them away by making a very, very loud noise. The boys giggled at such a silly idea, but Hercules smiled and thanked her. Sometimes the most fearsome problems cannot be solved by meeting them with equal force. Sometimes, the solution is not a sword, but a sound. Not a battle, but a change in the air. Have you ever found that the best way to solve a difficult problem was not to fight it head-on, but to approach it from a completely unexpected direction? The next afternoon, Hercules returned to the edge of the marsh, still at a loss for how to proceed. He stood there, watching the too still water, and he closed his eyes, uttering a quiet prayer to his protector, the goddess Athena. He asked the goddess of wisdom not for strength, but for an idea, a flash of inspiration. Just then, he heard a soft thud in the grass beside him, as though an apple had fallen from a tree. Opening his eyes, he looked down and saw a small, charmingly made pig, fashioned from painted clay. It was a child's toy. How strange, he thought, a toy pig appearing out of nowhere. He bent down and picked it up. As he did so, he noticed it made a sound, a soft rattling from within its hollow belly. Curious, he shook it gently, then with more force. He was startled by the result. The small, innocent-looking thing produced a deafeningly loud rattle, a sound like 1,000 clashing cymbals, a noise louder than thunder. And he knew. The goddess had answered his prayer. She had not given him a weapon, but a rattle. A divine tool in the most unexpected of forms. He waited patiently as the sun began to set once more. And just as before, the great bronze flock appeared, gliding across the sky towards the fields. This time, Hercules was ready. As the birds flew directly overhead, he raised the small clay pig and shook it with all his might. The sound that erupted was colossal, a terrifying clatter that shattered the eerie silence of the lake. The birds, caught completely by surprise, broke their formation in a panic. They scattered in confusion, their metallic wings clashing against each other, their synchronized flight dissolving into chaos. Then, as one, they turned and flew in the opposite direction, away from the lake, away from the fields, fleeing the terrible sound until they were nothing more than distant specks in the darkening sky. That was all it took. A single shake of a rattle. Grinning from ear to ear, Hercules returned to the family's home. He shared the good news and gave the magical rattle to the children as a gift, a souvenir of their time with a hero. The problem had been solved not with a sword, but with a sound. Not with violence, but with the wisdom of a goddess, and the innocent suggestion of a child. After the curious case of the Stymphalian birds, Hercules spent a peaceful week at his cousin's palace. He had enjoyed a well-deserved rest, spending his days drifting between his quiet bedroom and the sun-drenched beach, waking each morning for a refreshing swim in the sea before heading back for a long afternoon nap. One evening, as he watched the sun melt into the ocean from his bedroom window, turning the horizon into a band of liquid gold, he rolled a few cool, glass marbles in his palm. They were a gift from the king, a strange reward for his sixth labor, and a reminder of a childhood that felt a lifetime away. He found the smooth, cool feel of the glass to be deeply relaxing, a small, tangible anchor in his fantastical life. His rest, however, was about to come to an end. The king had his seventh task ready. This time, Hercules was to take a ship to the island of Crete and capture the great Cretan bull. That was all he knew. As always, the king was sparse with details. And so, Hercules found himself at sea once more, a passenger on a sturdy ship sailing south across the calm, blue waters of the Mediterranean. He lay stretched out on the deck, on planks of wood that had been warmed by the sun, his eyes closed, his mind empty. There was something about sea travel that he loved. He enjoyed the way he lost track of time, the way morning imperceptibly turned into afternoon, and a radiant dusk transformed into a clear, starlit night. He savored the sensation of being carried, of surrendering to the soothing, rhythmic rocking of the waves. It was deeply, profoundly relaxing. The bull, he thought, could wait. For now, he would simply enjoy this peace. One night, as he lay sleeping on the deck beneath the stars, he became aware of a presence. It was a warm, reassuring aura, a gentle light that seemed to pierce the darkness behind his closed eyelids. It reminded him of being a child, waking in the night to find his mother at his bedside. He opened his eyes, and there she was, standing just a few feet away, the goddess Athena. In the darkness, she glowed with her own ethereal light, a radiant figure of wisdom and strength. She had come, she explained with a slight smile, to give him the information the king had so carelessly omitted. She told him the story of the Cretan bull. The beast was no ordinary animal. It was a magnificent, gigantic, snow-white creature that had emerged from the sea, a gift to King Minos of Crete from the sea god Poseidon himself. But Minos, in his pride, had offended the god, and as punishment, Poseidon had driven the bull mad, causing it to run wild, rampaging through the fields and villages of the island. And there were other rumors, Athena added, her voice low. It was whispered that this divine, maddened bull had fathered a monster, a creature half man, half bull, known as the Minotaur. King Minos, full of shame and fear, kept this monstrous child hidden away from the world, trapped at the heart of a secret, underground labyrinth. Is a monster born, or is it made? The great Cretan bull, a creature of divine origin, ran wild and caused fear. Its child, the Minotaur, was locked away in darkness. Were these creatures evil by nature, or were they simply the tragic products of the pride and fear of gods and kings? Hercules didn't need to worry about the Minotaur, Athena assured him. But the bull was another matter. King Minos had been unable to capture it. That was why Hercules was being sent to Crete. His task was to subdue the beast and remove it from the island. With a final word of encouragement, the goddess faded into the night sky, leaving Hercules alone on the deck, his mind swimming with images of white bulls and secret labyrinths. When he arrived in Crete, he found a land that was gentle and green, a place of sloping hills and soft, sandy beaches. He explored on foot, walking for a whole day along the coastline, talking to fishermen and children playing in the shallows. They all told him the same thing: keep walking. The bull, after a day of rampaging, often came to the beach to rest. And so, as the sun began to set, he finally saw it. At the far end of the beach, resting in the sand just a few feet from the incoming tide, lay the most majestic creature he had ever seen. It was snow-white and as large as a building, a monumental sculpture of living muscle. As it lay there, tranquil and still, Hercules could sense its immense, divine power. As he drew closer, the great bull stood up, towering over him, its horns seeming to graze the clouds. It let out a scornful huff, as if to say, "You think you can defeat me?" But Hercules didn't think. He knew. The battle that followed was not one of weapons, but of pure, primal strength. Hercules wrapped his powerful arms around the bull's neck, and for several long minutes, they were locked in a titanic wrestling match, a struggle of pushing and pulling on the golden sand. The bull was immensely powerful, but it had never encountered a strength like this, a strength born of a god. At last, sensing it had met its match, the bull surrendered, its defiance replaced by a grudging respect. Gently, Hercules placed a rope around the creature's neck. And as the setting sun turned the sky pink and the sea to gold, the great Cretan bull followed him peacefully across the sand, ready to be led away from the island it had once terrorized. He had faced a creature born of divine power and royal pride, and he had tamed it not just with his strength, but with a will that was even stronger. Hercules returned from Crete with the great white bull, another impossible task completed, another testament to his incredible strength. The people cheered, and his cousin, the king, offered praise through a smile that was growing thinner and more strained with each of Hercules's triumphs. Having failed to best him with monsters of mythic power or challenges of impossible endurance, King Eurystheus now turned to a task of a different sort, one steeped not in divine magic, but in the darkness of human cruelty. For his eighth labor, the king ordered Hercules to travel to the distant, rugged land of Thrace, a wild region to the northeast of Greece. There, he was to capture the mares of King Diomedes and bring them back to the palace. It sounded simple enough, but Hercules knew from the cruel glint in his cousin's eye that this was no ordinary errand. The journey itself was a challenge, a long voyage across the Aegean Sea to a land that felt older, wilder, and less touched by the civilizing hands of the gods. The shores of Thrace were not the gentle, sandy beaches of Crete, they were rocky and battered by a restless sea. The forests were dark and dense, the wind carrying a mournful howl through the pines. It was a land that felt untamed and dangerous. And it was ruled by a king who was just as savage. King Diomedes, it was said, was the son of Ares, the god of war, and he had inherited all of his father's brutality without any of his martial honor. The king kept a stable of magnificent wild horses, creatures as swift as the wind and as wild as a storm-tossed ocean. But their wildness was tainted by a terrible corruption. For King Diomedes, in his cruelty, fed his horses not on oats and grass, but on the flesh of his unsuspecting guests. Strangers who sought shelter in his palace would be seized and thrown to the mares, their master taking a depraved pleasure in watching the gruesome spectacle. Can cruelty be taught? Are these horses, these beautiful creatures, truly evil, or are they themselves victims, twisted into flesh-eating monsters by the profound evil of their human master? And what does it say about a hero when, in order to tame a monster, he must sometimes use its own master's cruelty against it? Hercules made his way under the cover of darkness towards the palace of Diomedes. He found the stables and saw the 4 magnificent horses, one black, one white, one red, and one dappled gray. They were tethered to their mangers with heavy iron chains, and even in the dim moonlight, he could see the wild, unnatural fire in their eyes. These were not mere animals, they were instruments of terror. With his immense strength, Hercules overpowered the stable hands, broke the iron chains, and began to lead the horses away towards the sea. But King Diomedes was soon alerted to the theft. With his soldiers, he pursued Hercules, cornering him on the beach. A fierce battle ensued. Hercules, a son of Zeus, was more than a match for any mortal army, but as he fought, the wild mares, agitated by the sounds of conflict, began to snarl and snap, their predatory instincts fully aroused. And then, in the chaos of the battle, King Diomedes fell. He was thrown to the ground, wounded and helpless, right before the creatures he had so cruelly conditioned. And the horses, drawn by a scent they knew all too well, surrounded their master. Hercules turned away, not wanting to witness the grim, poetic justice that was about to unfold. There was a terrible sound, a chorus of furious snorting and stamping, and then, a dreadful silence. When Hercules looked again, King Diomedes was gone. And the horses were changed. The wild, bloodthirsty fire in their eyes had been extinguished. The madness that had been fed by their master's cruelty had been sated by consuming its very source. Now, they stood calmly, their heads bowed, their sides no longer heaving with unnatural rage. The evil had been purged. Miraculously tame, the 4 magnificent horses followed Hercules without protest. He led them back to his ship and began the long journey home. He had not just captured a set of dangerous beasts. He had, in a strange and terrible way, cleansed them. He had faced a darkness born not of myth or magic, but of the human heart, and he had used that same darkness to bring about its own demise. It was a somber victory, one that left him with a quiet sense of unease. He had completed his 8th labor, and in doing so, had learned that the most terrifying monsters in the world are often the ones that walk on 2 legs. Having tamed both divine beasts and those corrupted by human evil, Hercules returned once more to the palace. His cousin, King Eurystheus, was now faced with a hero whose abilities seemed to grow with every challenge. For the 9th labor, he devised a quest that would take Hercules further than ever before, to the edge of the known world, to face an entire nation of legendary warriors. His task, to travel to the land of the Amazons and retrieve the golden belt of their queen, Hippolyta. For the first time in his labors, Hercules did not set out alone. The journey would be long and perilous, across the Aegean and into the Black Sea, through lands where hostile tribes were said to roam. He was accompanied by a small army of his friends, loyal soldiers he had known since childhood. The presence of these companions brought a new sense of warmth and camaraderie to his quest, but also a new weight of responsibility. After a long and arduous voyage, they finally caught sight of the distant shore, and the plumes of campfire smoke that rose above the trees. This was the land of the Amazons. As they made their way inland, they were met at the border of the settlement by a group of female warriors. They were tall and strong, their eyes sharp and intelligent, and they held their spears with a casual confidence that spoke of a lifetime of training. Hercules, in a gesture of peace, explained that he had not come for war, but to speak with their queen. The warriors negotiated. Hercules could enter, they said, but he could not bring his army. After some discussion, he was allowed to bring just one companion, his trusted friend Creos. It was not ideal, but Hercules saw it as a positive sign. If the Amazons had wanted a battle, they would already be fighting. Instead, they were willing to talk. He was led to a large tent at the center of the settlement. Inside, he was struck by the surprisingly domestic atmosphere. In the middle of the tent, sitting cross-legged on a large, soft rug, was a woman with dark, striking features and a gentle expression. This was Hippolyta, the warrior queen. Sitting beside her, listening intently, was her young daughter. Seeing them there, in this cozy, peaceful scene, Hercules felt his own guard relax. In a world of swords and spears, what is the true power of a story? Can words be stronger than weapons? Hercules came to this land expecting a battle, but in that moment, he made a decision. He would not lead with his strength, but with his story. He asked for permission to sit, and once settled on the rug opposite the queen, he began to speak. The words flowed out of him. He told her everything. He spoke of the oracle at Delphi, of the king's commands, and of the 8 labors he had already completed. He described the impenetrable hide of the Nemean Lion, the regenerating heads of the Hydra, the year-long chase of the Golden Hind, and the ingenious cleansing of the stables. He spoke of his triumphs, but also of his moments of doubt and despair. He spoke not as a boastful warrior, but as a man on a long and difficult journey, bound by a strange destiny. Hippolyta and her daughter listened, spellbound. When he had finished, the queen looked at him with a newfound respect and admiration. She was so inspired by his tale of heroism and endurance that she made a promise. She would give him the belt. It was a treasured possession, a gift from her father, the war god Ares, but she felt that Hercules had earned it. He could return in the morning to claim his prize. Relieved and grateful, Hercules retired to his tent, believing his mission was all but complete. But he was not the only one with a divine parent. The goddess Hera, his eternal enemy, had been watching. Enraged that Hercules might achieve this difficult task so peacefully, she worked her mischief in the night. She crept into the dreams of the sleeping Amazon women, planting seeds of distrust. She sent them troubling visions of Hercules not as a hero, but as a treacherous visitor who had come to kidnap their beloved queen. The next morning, the atmosphere in the camp had changed completely. When Hercules went to the queen's tent, he found it blocked by a line of heavily armed warriors, their faces cold and suspicious. Hippolyta herself emerged, but she was no longer the approachable mother from the day before. She was now dressed in full battle armor, her expression hard and unforgiving. She told him of the dreams that all the women had shared, dreams that warned them he was not to be trusted. Regretfully, she said, she could no longer give him the belt. He and his friend would have to leave immediately. Just as a battle seemed inevitable, a brilliant light filled the tent. The goddess Athena appeared, standing between Hercules and the queen. She was radiant and imposing in her own shining armor. The Amazons gasped in awe. Athena, the goddess of both wisdom and warfare, was a figure they deeply respected. She turned to Hippolyta and spoke, not as a god to a mortal, but as one warrior to another. She vouched for Hercules, explaining Hera's treachery and assuring the queen that Hercules' intentions were honorable. He was on a divine path, she said, and Hippolyta should not stand in his way. Her word was law. There could be no greater endorsement. Awed and humbled, Hippolyta looked at Hercules with a new understanding. She untied the heavy leather and bronze belt from her waist, the treasured gift from her father, and handed it to him. With a smile of mutual respect, the hero and the warrior queen parted ways. Hercules had completed his ninth, and most complex, labor. He had faced down an entire nation, battled the treachery of a goddess, and won his prize not with his sword, but with a story, his integrity, and the help of a divine friend. After the complex affair in the land of the Amazons, Hercules returned with the queen's belt, his ninth labor complete. King Eurystheus, now running out of earthly challenges, devised a task that was not just difficult, but seemingly impossible. It was a quest rooted in pure myth, a journey to a place that may not have even existed. He ordered Hercules to travel to the very edge of the world, find the legendary garden of the Hesperides, and bring back 3 of its golden apples. The problem was that no mortal knew the location of this secret garden. It belonged to the goddess Hera, and its apples were said to grant immortality. Hercules knew his first task was not one of strength, but of a search for knowledge. He was told that the only being who knew the way was Nereus, the ancient, shape-shifting god of the sea. Hercules found the old sea god sleeping on a remote pebble beach. Knowing that Nereus would not give up his secrets easily, Hercules crept up and seized him. What followed was not a fight, but a bizarre and surreal wrestling match with reality itself. Nereus, in an attempt to escape, transformed, his form shifting with bewildering speed. One moment, Hercules was holding onto the rough shirt of an old man, the next, he was grappling with the slippery body of a seal, then the coiling form of a sea serpent, then a torrent of rushing water, then a roaring fire. But Hercules, with his divine strength and unshakable resolve, simply held on. He clung to the elusive, ever-changing god, refusing to let go. Finally, exhausted, Nereus returned to his true form. He had been bested. Bound by the laws of his nature, the god of truth whispered the secret to Hercules. The garden, he said, was in the far, far west, where the sky met the earth. But Hercules could not take the apples himself. The garden was guarded by the Hesperides, the nymph daughters of a mighty Titan. And that Titan, Nereus revealed, was named Atlas. Following the sea god's directions, Hercules traveled west, further than any mortal had ever gone before. He journeyed for weeks, until he came to the edge of the world. And there, he found the garden of the Hesperides. It was a place of breathtaking, magical beauty, bathed in the soft, golden light of a perpetual sunset. The air was filled with a fragrance both earthy and floral, and the leaves of the trees seemed to glow from within. In a clearing at the heart of the garden, he saw the apple trees, their branches heavy with fruit that shone like miniature suns. Lying in the grass beneath the trees were the 3 sleeping nymphs. But Hercules knew he could not simply take the apples. He had another destination. Leaving the garden behind, he climbed a great mountain that stood at the edge of the world. And there, on its rocky peak, he beheld a sight of profound and humbling awe. A figure of immense size, a Titan, stood with his back to him, his powerful arms raised, holding the entire weight of the starry heavens on his shoulders. This was Atlas. Hercules approached the great Titan and made his proposal. He knew Atlas was the father of the Hesperides. If Atlas would go to the garden and retrieve 3 golden apples for him, Hercules, in exchange, would take his place and hold up the sky, granting the Titan a few precious moments of rest. Atlas, his voice a low rumble of eternal weariness, looked at the mortal hero with disbelief, but the prospect of even a brief holiday was too tempting to resist. He agreed. And so, the man and the Titan exchanged places. As Atlas carefully shifted the celestial sphere from his own shoulders to those of Hercules, the hero felt a weight so immense, so absolute, that it was beyond physical description. It was not just heavy, it was the burden of all creation, the responsibility for every star and every constellation. Humbled and filled with an extraordinary sense of power, Hercules stood firm, his legs like pillars of stone, his divine strength holding the cosmos in place. Atlas returned a short while later, a look of joyful relief on his face, the 3 golden apples glinting in his hands. But, having tasted freedom, he was reluctant to take up his burden again. "I will deliver these apples to the king for you," he said slyly. "You just wait here. I will be back, eventually." Hercules knew he had been tricked. He was trapped. But his mind, now as sharp as his muscles, worked quickly. "An excellent idea," he said to the Titan. "But before you go, could you just take the sky back for one moment? The weight is not quite balanced, and I need to place my cloak on my shoulders to create a better cushion." The weary Titan, not thinking clearly in his blissful state of freedom, agreed. He set the apples down and once more took the weight of the heavens onto his shoulders. In that instant, Hercules swiftly bent down, picked up the 3 golden apples, and with a polite word of thanks, he turned and began his journey down the mountain. He had outwitted a Titan. He had the apples. He had completed the most difficult labor of all, a task that took him to the end of the world and required him to bear the weight of the heavens. But as he bathed in a mountain stream on his journey home, the goddess Athena appeared before him. The apples, she explained gently, were not meant for the mortal world. They were too powerful, a fruit of the gods. He could show them to King Eurystheus to prove his labor was complete, but then, they must be returned to the garden. Athena herself would see to it. Hercules understood. His reward was not the prize itself, but the journey. It was the knowledge he had gained wrestling with the sea god, the awesome responsibility he had felt holding up the sky, and the cunning he had discovered within himself to outwit a god. This was the true climax of his quest, a moment that proved he was more than just a strongman. He was a hero worthy of his divine heritage. Having outwitted a titan and stood at the very edge of the world, Hercules returned the golden apples to the goddess Athena, his 11th labor complete. Only one task remained. King Eurystheus, his imagination now reaching beyond the mortal realm, assigned Hercules his 12th and final labor, a quest so daunting, so impossible, that it was surely meant to be his last. He was to descend into Hades, the underworld, and bring back its fearsome guardian, Cerberus, the three-headed dog. To journey to the land of the dead and return alive was something no mortal had ever done. Hercules knew that for this mission, strength and courage were not enough. He needed something more. He needed spiritual fortification. And so, before beginning his descent, he traveled to the sanctuary of Eleusis to take part in the sacred Eleusinian mysteries. For 9 days, he participated in ancient rituals designed to cleanse the soul and grant insight into the great mysteries of life, death, and rebirth. He fasted, he bathed in the sea, he joined solemn processions, and he drank a sacred brew that opened his mind to a new kind of clarity. When the rituals were complete, he felt transformed, not just stronger, but surer of his place in the world. He was no longer just a hero, he was an initiate, ready to walk the path between the realms. The greatest fear for many is the fear of the unknown, the fear of what lies beyond the veil of life. What do you think gives a person the courage to face their deepest fears? Is it strength, knowledge, or the faith that you are not walking into the darkness alone? For Hercules, it was all three. He traveled to the southernmost tip of the mainland, to a dark cave where the blue waves of the Mediterranean washed over the rocks. This was the entrance to Hades. As his small boat drifted from the bright sunlight into the cool gloom of the cave, he felt a shiver of apprehension. And then, he felt another presence. A soft, ethereal glow filled the boat, and he turned to see his protector, the goddess Athena, sitting beside him. She had come, she said, to be his guide. With a goddess at his side, Hercules felt his fear melt away, replaced by a calm resolve. Slowly, the boat drifted deeper into the earth, following a subterranean river. The darkness was absolute at first, but then it began to soften, giving way to a strange, silvery twilight. They had left the world of the sun behind and entered the underworld. It was not a place of fire and torment as some stories claimed. It was a vast, misty, and melancholic landscape, illuminated by an invisible moon. The air was still, and everything, the grassy riverbanks, the tall reeds, the pale, star-shaped asphodel flowers, was bathed in an uncanny, silver sheen. Guided by Athena, Hercules rode along the silent river until they came to the asphodel meadows, the resting place for the souls of ordinary people. He saw them, the spirits of the dead, wandering peacefully through the tall grass, their forms solid yet translucent. They were calm and content, freed from the worries of mortal life. Further on, they passed the land of dreams, a spectacular labyrinth of glittering palaces that seemed to be made of pure mist. At last, they found him. In a secluded, shadowy grove, among fields of grey, glittering poppies, stood Hades, the king of the underworld. He was a tall, imposing figure with stern grey eyes, but he was not menacing. He stood there quietly, with a basket of flowers slung over his arm, a gift for his returning wife, Persephone. With Athena acting as his emissary, Hercules respectfully explained his quest. Hades listened, his expression unreadable. He agreed to let Hercules take Cerberus, but only on one condition: he must overpower the beast with his bare hands, without the use of any weapons. It was a test of pure dominance. A man, even a hero, had to be the master of his dog. Hercules accepted the challenge. They traveled to the gates of the underworld, and there he was. Cerberus was an impressive, terrifying beast, with a sleek black body the size of a bear and 3 enormous, snarling heads. But Hercules, his heart filled with a divine courage, did not flinch. What followed was a swift and decisive battle of will. Hercules wrestled the great dog to the ground, his immense strength pressing down on the creature. But it was more than just strength. Cerberus, a creature of instinct, seemed to recognize the divine authority in Hercules, the power of a man who could walk between worlds. The beast ceased its struggling, and with a low whimper, it submitted, acknowledging the hero as its new master. With Athena's help, a magical key that opened the locked gates, they began their ascent. They climbed a long, steep flight of stairs, up and up, until Hercules caught a glimpse of light. It was not the subtle, silvery glow of the underworld, but warm, golden, pure sunlight. He felt a sudden surge of joy in his chest. A moment later, they were standing outside the cave, back in the land of the living. The world seemed impossibly vibrant. The grass was a rich, deep green, the poppies a brilliant ruby red. He was so happy to be back that he laughed from sheer joy. His final, most perilous labor was complete. He had walked in the land of the dead, and he had returned. Hercules emerged from the dark cave into the warm, golden sunlight of the living world, the goddess Athena at his side, and the great, 3-headed Cerberus held by a chain. He had done it. He had completed his 12th and final labor. When they eventually arrived back at the palace, there was quite a crowd waiting for them. News had spread throughout the land like wildfire. Hercules, immortal, had gone to the underworld and returned, alive. And he had brought its guardian with him. The people stood in awed silence, their eyes wide, for they were witnessing not just their hero and the legendary 3-headed dog, but a goddess, too, her form glowing with an ethereal light. At the center of the crowd stood King Eurystheus. He stared, speechless, at the magnificent, terrifying beast. This was it. There were no more tasks to give, no more impossible quests to devise. He had been bested. He took a few tentative steps towards the dog, but Cerberus lunged forward with a ferocious bark, and the king made a hasty retreat. He had tamed a boar and a bull, but this, he admitted, was a creature far beyond him. A dog like this needed a god, or a hero, as its master. Fortunately, Athena had a solution. She would take Cerberus back to the underworld where he belonged. But perhaps, she mused, she could make a deal with Hades. The dog seemed to enjoy the sunlight, and he had clearly taken a shine to Hercules. Maybe, like Hades' wife Persephone, Cerberus could be allowed to go back and forth between the realms, spending some of his time in the sun. It was the perfect arrangement. Hercules gave the great dog an affectionate pat on each of its 3 heads, promising they would see each other again. And then, he stood with the crowd and watched as the goddess and the hound of Hades set off on their walk, eventually fading from view. The king declared that Hercules had now, officially, completed his 12 labors. He was free. A great cheer erupted from the crowd. They had followed his adventures for years, through the stories shared at feasts and the songs of traveling bards. They knew of the lion and the Hydra, of the golden deer and the world's end. And now, they rejoiced with him. As for Hercules, he was overwhelmed. Joy, pride, and a profound sense of relief all washed over him in a bewildering wave. It would take time, he knew, for everything to truly sink in. For now, all he could do was smile. That evening, a grand banquet was held in his honor. Every bench in the great hall was filled with people, and the tables groaned under the weight of all the food and wine. A bard plucked a lyre and began to sing songs of Hercules' adventures, the very stories we have just shared. Hercules ate, drank, and celebrated along with everyone else, but as the evening wore on, a deep, profound tiredness began to settle in his bones. He found himself yawning, longing for the quiet and comfort of his bed. He had earned it. He had certainly earned it. But before he went to sleep, there was one more thing he needed to do. Slipping away from the noisy, joyful celebration, he walked across the cool grass towards the stables. The sound of the banquet faded behind him, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets and the soft whisper of the night air. In the stables, his beloved horse, Ianthe, greeted him with a happy, welcoming snort. Hercules buried his head in the horse's neck, breathing in that comforting, familiar smell of hay and home. This was his true reward. Not the feasts, not the songs, not the praise of the crowd. But this quiet reunion with his most faithful companion. He stroked her head, promising her that once he had had a good long rest, they would go on more adventures together, new adventures of their own choosing. Then, after kissing Ianthe good night, he left the stables and went up to his bedroom. It was a humble room, with a simple wooden bed, but to his eyes, it was the most luxurious room in the entire world. He took a bath, the warm water soothing his weary muscles, and changed into a clean linen tunic that felt impossibly soft against his skin. He blew out the flame of the oil lamp and settled down in bed, relishing the softness of the mattress, the freshness of the sheets. It was heavenly. He was so comfortable, and so deeply, profoundly tired. After all the monsters and all the miles, after holding up the sky and walking in the land of the dead, what is a hero's greatest reward? Is it the roar of the crowd? The praise of a king? Or is it the quiet of a familiar stable, and the promise of a long, deep, and blissful sleep? Hercules' 12 labors were over. Now, at long, long last, he could truly rest. And so, he did. He closed his eyes, and he let his breathing become slow and deep. With each breath, he felt himself slipping, drifting gently into the quiet, welcoming realm of dreams. At the end of all his adventures, This was his final, greatest reward. The deepest, most blissful sleep. A hero's sleep. As our story now comes to its end, perhaps you, too, can feel that same sense of peace, that same invitation to rest. Good night.